Hey guys! Today we step straight into a world that would make your soft modern life crumble in less than a day, the harsh, unrelenting Middle Ages. Imagine it. The air is damp with wood smoke and rot, your stomach already tight with hunger, and the street beneath your boots runs slick with mud and waste. You probably won't survive this. You open your eyes and find yourself in a one-room hut. The smell of yesterday's stew, if you can call it that, still clinging to the rafters. Outside, church bells hammer the morning, and you know your body is about to be pushed through another endless day of toil, disease, and fear. There are no comforts here, no escape, only survival. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing that map light up from night owls to early birds to the mysterious few who tune in at 3 a.m. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step out into the gray dawn, and the first thing that greets you is not the sound of lutes or the smell of roasting meat from a banquet hall. No, what fills your senses is the bitter reek of thin cabbage stew simmering in an iron pot that hasn't been scrubbed for weeks. Forget the grand feasts you've seen in movies, the roasted swans and golden platters of turkey legs. For nearly everyone alive in the Middle Ages, food was monotony wrapped in hunger. The peasant staple was pottage, a watery stew of beans, peas, leeks, onions, whatever happened to grow in a small strip of field. Day after day, the same pot simmered, scraps tossed in, ladle after ladle taken out, until the mixture grew thick with flavors of dirt, insects, and ash. It was the medieval version of Mom's mystery stew, except instead of hiding vegetables, it hid weevils crawling from old barley and flecks of grit that clung to your teeth. Bread was the one constant, but don't imagine the fluffy white loaf of a supermarket. Medieval bread was black, dense, and heavy. Stone-ground flour carried chips of the millstone itself, so chewing felt like grinding gravel. Archaeologists have found medieval skeletons with teeth worn down to the gums not because of age, but because every meal sanded their molars into dust. Strong teeth didn't come from good genes, they came from chewing rocks. And there was something far worse lurking in the rye fields: ergot. This deadly fungus spread across damp harvests and laced the bread with poison. A single bite could twist your body with burning spasms, or worse, send you into wild hallucinations. Entire villages may have seen visions of demons and witches, not from sorcery, but from tainted bread. Some historians even suggest the witch panics of the late Middle Ages were sparked not by Satan, but by bakers who didn't clean their sacks of grain. Meat for the poor was a luxury, a fleeting taste. When it did arrive, it was usually rotten, crawling with flies, and slimy with decay. Without refrigeration, the smell of pork or beef turned quickly. The rich cloaked their meat in cinnamon and cloves shipped across dangerous seas. But the poor, they held their nose and swallowed. The 5-second rule in the Middle Ages was closer to the 5-day rule. And water? The very element of life could kill you. Streams ran brown with waste, rivers choked with butcher's blood and privy drains. Drinking straight from the village well was like inviting dysentery into your body. The solution was ale weak, foamy, sour, but safer than water. Even children drank it. Records show the average medieval peasant guzzled 8 pints of small beer a day. Picture a 5-year-old sitting down to breakfast, clutching a wooden cup of ale, because milk soured too quickly and water was poison. Fish was the fallback, though seldom fresh unless you lived by the sea. For those inland, fish arrived days, even weeks, after being salted stiff or dried to leather. Imagine the smell sharp enough to make your eyes water, yet it was food. And hunger was merciless. But food in the Middle Ages wasn't just survival. It was hierarchy. A noble's table groaned under roasted boar, exotic spices, and sweetened wine, while peasants gnawed on coarse bread and roots. Feasts in the castle served as theater, where glistening meats and sugared fruits proclaimed wealth and power. Down below, the same night, a family huddled over a single bowl of pottage, fighting off hunger with each thin sip. Still, there are moments of humanity hidden in the hunger. Picture a winter evening. A mother ladles stew into a wooden bowl, carefully counting portions for 6 children. A father breaks his last loaf in silence, pressing the bigger piece into a child's hands. No feasts, no banquets, just survival laced with tenderness. And yet, starvation was always near. A failed harvest meant death. Chroniclers wrote of villages where bark was ground into bread, where cats and dogs vanished into the cookpot. In the famine of 1317, entire regions of Europe starved, parents abandoned children by the roadside, and travelers wrote of gaunt corpses lining the paths like milestones. So when you think of medieval food, erase the banquet halls and the roasted birds, replace them with the smell of sour ale, the crunch of grit in black bread, and the bitter taste of boiled weeds. For the people who lived through it, eating wasn't pleasure, it was simply the daily battle to stay alive one more day. Step closer to the market square, and you'll notice something sharp and sour pricking your nostrils. It isn't fresh fruit or roasted chicken wafting through the air. It's the unmistakable stench of meat going bad under the open sky. In an age without refrigeration, without ice or sealed containers, meat was a gamble you played with your stomach every time you took a bite. For peasants, meat was rare. A festival day, a wedding, a small miracle of fortune might bring a strip of pork or a slice of mutton to the table. By the time it reached you, the fat sweated green, and the flies had claimed their portion. To mask the rot, cooks drowned the flesh in spices. If you were wealthy, this meant cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg treasures carried by caravans across deserts and oceans. If you were poor, it meant a splash of vinegar, some wild garlic, and hope. Imagine the scene, a slab of beef laid out on a wooden board, mottled with gray. The butcher hacks away the worst patches, sprinkles on herbs, and hands it across with a grin. You take it home because hunger doesn't allow dignity. By the fire, the smell of decay lingers even after it's charred. You eat anyway, swallowing quickly, praying the pain in your belly tomorrow won't be worse than the ache today. And then there was an even crueler trick of survival. Along the coasts, fresh herring or cod might still glisten, scales catching the sun, but inland? Fish was often weeks old, stiff with salt, leathery as cured hide. Travelers wrote of markets where barrels of fish smelled so strong they could knock a man senseless before he reached the stall. Yet people bought them, boiled them, chewed them, because meat was scarce and fasting days enforced by the church demanded fish instead. The church calendar ruled not only prayers but diet. Nearly half the year was spent in some form of fasting. When meat was forbidden, fish salted, dried, or pickled became the lifeline. Monasteries along the coasts built entire economies on fish ponds and trade, feeding cities hundreds of miles inland. Records tell of rivers so overfished that laws had to be written forbidding the taking of certain species during spawning seasons. And still, the hunger pressed on. Water, however, was the most treacherous element of all. Imagine standing before a clear brook, sunlight sparkling across its surface. You cup your hands, lift the water to your lips, and you may as well have scooped up disease itself. Human waste, animal dung, tanner's runoff, and slaughterhouse blood all found their way into rivers and wells. To drink water straight was to invite fever, dysentery, and death. The answer, paradoxically, was beer. Not the frothy golden pint of today, but a weak, cloudy brew called small beer. It contained just enough alcohol to kill germs, but not enough to intoxicate, at least not quickly. Children drank it as casually as you might sip juice. A boy of 6 might gulp down a pint before trudging into the fields, while his father drank 3 more to quench thirst under the noonday sun. Records from 14th century England suggest the average peasant consumed 8 pints of ale a day. 8 pints. Not because they were drunkards, but because water was a weapon. Even monasteries brewed beer as a daily ration, carefully measured and distributed to monks. In some towns, alewives women who brewed in their homes became central figures in survival, their names whispered as blessings when the buckets arrived foaming and warm. Picture the paradox: children holding mugs of beer with breakfast, mothers pouring ale for toddlers, fathers staggering under the dual burden of fieldwork and constant consumption. To us, it sounds scandalous. To them, it was life itself. Every sip was safer than water, every mouthful a shield against unseen death. And yet, it tethered their existence to the brew. Days without it brought thirst, sickness, weakness. Entire communities pulsed with the rhythm of ale, from dawn chores to midnight prayers. Food and drink in the Middle Ages were more than fuel. They were a mirror of inequality, of danger, of fragility. Nobles feasted under candlelight, their tables heavy with spices and roasts, while the common people chewed grit-laden bread, gnawed salted fish, and raised wooden mugs of beer to lips still sticky with dirt. So when you next imagine yourself at a medieval table, don't see goblets of wine or roasted pheasant. See instead a family huddled over a battered pot, the father tearing a chunk from a blackened loaf, the mother spooning thin broth, the children sipping small beer because water could kill them. This was not luxury, it was endurance, a fragile truce with hunger, one bite, one sip at a time. Step deeper into the streets, and you'll quickly learn that medieval cities were not only hungry, they were foul. Imagine walking down a narrow lane in London or Paris. The stones beneath your feet are slick with rain, but that wetness isn't just water. Overhead, a window creaks open. A woman shouts a warning, "Gardez l'eau," from the French "Gardez l'eau," meaning watch out for the water. You glance up just in time to leap aside as a bucket of human waste splashes into the gutter. This was no accident. It was the system. Chamber pots, simple bowls, or buckets kept beneath the bed were emptied into the street. If you lived in a multi-story house, that meant your waste rained down on neighbors, strangers, even merchants selling bread. Some cities tried to regulate the chaos. Paris, for instance, required waste to be thrown only at night. But laws written on parchment didn't erase the stench baked into every alley by morning. Inside castles, conditions weren't much better. Forget the idea of golden thrones royalty sat on garderobes, stone seats with a hole that dropped directly down the wall. At Dover Castle, archaeologists discovered one shaft plunging nearly 70 feet, a cold wind whistling up the tunnel to bite the user. Kings and queens may have worn crowns, but their toilets were drafty holes above rivers of filth. For those caught between home and castle, public options were grim. Common privies stood over rivers, crude wooden platforms with holes cut in them. People shuffled in, did their business, and left everything to the current. The Thames became a monster of stink, choked with waste and refuse. Chroniclers described its waters as thick, black, and writhing with things best left unnamed. And yet, someone had to deal with the buildup. Enter the gong farmers, the night soil men. Their job, descend into cesspits with buckets, scrape human waste by the ton, and haul it beyond the city walls. They worked only after sundown, the smell clinging to them so fiercely they were forbidden from entering taverns or churches. Society shunned them. But paradoxically, they earned 4 times the wage of an ordinary laborer. Few jobs paid so well, fewer jobs killed the appetite so completely. Toilet paper? Forget it. In fields and huts, people used leaves, moss, scraps of linen, or simply their left hand. Among the wealthy, wool or hemp served as a luxury. In monasteries, scraps of parchment too worn for scripture found second life. Romans centuries earlier had used sponges on sticks dipped in vinegar. By the Middle Ages, that knowledge had mostly vanished, replaced with improvisation. Imagine the indignity of it. You finish your ale, step outside to relieve yourself, crouch in a corner by the town wall. There is no privacy, no plumbing, just the shame of hoping no one passes. Even nobles weren't spared. Servants often stood nearby, ready with cloths or buckets. Privacy, like cleanliness, was a luxury not yet invented. And the smell god, the smell. Every street became a chamber pot, every gutter an open sewer. Mix that with butchers dumping entrails outside shops, tanners rinsing hides in urine, and pigs rooting freely in the muck, and you have a cityscape that could choke the breath from your lungs. People carried pomander-steiny balls of herbs or flowers to hold beneath their noses, a medieval version of air freshener. Without them, daily life was an assault on the senses. Yet within this filth, resilience grew. Waste fertilized fields, cesspits, when emptied, became the basis of farming cycles. Even gong farmers, despised and reeking, were vital to survival. The system was crude, but it kept life moving, one bucket at a time. Picture it. You stand in a medieval street, mud and dung squelching beneath your boots. A neighbor tips a pot from her window, and the crowd barely glances. Life continues, bargaining at the market, children chasing chickens, monks threading through the chaos. The stench is unbearable to you, but to them it is ordinary, woven into every breath of daily survival. This was the medieval bathroom experience, a world where filth was constant, where survival meant tolerance, and where every drop of water or ale carried the shadow of waste. To step outside in these cities was to walk through a living sewer. And yet, people endured, built, prayed, and even thrived amid the muck. That was the miracle of their endurance, not cleanliness, but persistence in spite of it. The first thing you notice when you enter a medieval town is not the sight of the wooden houses or the sound of church bells, but the smell. It strikes like a fist. Imagine the sharp tang of tanner's urine, the sweetness of rotting fruit, the coppery reek of butchered animals, the acrid smoke of hundreds of hearth fires, all of it layered with the sour stench of human waste. The city is alive, yes, but alive like a wound. Chroniclers spoke of the stench of London, describing the Thames as a river of filth. It was said the water flowed thick and dark, a monster of stink that carried not only sewage but the carcasses of animals. Butchers dumped entrails straight into the current, where they tangled with reeds and boats alike. In summer, the heat baked this stew into the air itself, so that even nobles in their halls could not escape the reek seeping through stone walls. Streets were no better. Garbage was tossed outside doors, bones, rags, spoiled food where pigs and dogs rooted through the piles. Rain spread the rot into black puddles. Imagine stepping out of your doorway and sinking ankle-deep into a slurry of ash, straw, blood, and dung. For city dwellers, this wasn't shocking. It was simply Tuesday. To cope, people carried pomanders, little balls of wax or silver stuffed with herbs, cloves, or lavender. Wealthy ladies held them to their noses when walking through markets, a delicate act of survival disguised as elegance. For the poor, a sprig of mint tucked behind the ear was sometimes all they could manage. Yet no scent lasted long enough to outfight the city itself. Even the countryside wasn't immune. Villages too small to have walls still had dung heaps, pigsties, and stagnant ponds. Farmers spread night soil, human waste collected by gong farmers over fields. It was efficient, but when the wind shifted, the fields stank so sharply that even oxen balked at the plow. And then there was smoke. Every home burned wood, peat, or coal. On still nights, the haze sank into alleys until the air tasted like soot. Imagine breathing this day after day, your lungs never free of the weight. By 40, a cough deepened into a wheeze. By 50, if you live so long, each breath rasped with the memory of 1,000 fires. Noise and smell often fused. The slaughterhouse rang with the squeals of pigs as blood ran in channels through the street. Tanneries hissed with boiling vats, their fumes curling over riverbanks. Open sewers burbled in the background. Life was a symphony of stinks and sounds, as constant as the tolling of bells. Yet the smells were not just nuisances, they shaped belief. Disease, people thought, came from miasma, bad air, the stink of rot itself. If a plague swept through town, noses turned toward the gutters, the butchers, the privies. People lit fires of juniper or carried herbs not only for comfort but as protection. To breathe lavender, they thought, was to shield one's soul. And sometimes they were right. Filth bred rats, rats carried fleas, fleas carried plague. The line between stink and death was shorter than they realized. In a way, they were correct. The smell was disease. Picture yourself on a summer afternoon in medieval Paris. The streets are clogged with carts, the sun beats on stone, and the air is so heavy you feel you could chew it. A vendor sells apples nearby, their sweetness barely masking the odor of the tanner's pit down the street. You try to breathe shallowly, but the air refuses to be ignored. By evening, the stench clings to your clothes, your hair, your very skin. There is no escape, not even in sleep. And yet, life went on. People married, traded, laughed, and prayed amid the stink. Children played in alleys, darting between piles of refuse. Markets bustled with buyers, noses wrinkled but hands busy. Human beings adapted, as they always do, turning the unbearable into background noise. The smell became part of the rhythm of existence, a constant reminder of survival. For you, a visitor from the future, the odor would drive you to madness in hours. But for them, it was the air they were born into. They did not endure it. They belonged to it. This was the medieval world of smell, not a fleeting nuisance, but a permanent companion woven into every breath of life. To live here meant to live with filth pressed against your senses, teaching you day by day that survival was not clean, but messy, pungent, and unforgettable. Step outside the crowded town and walk into the open fields. The smell of rot and smoke fades, replaced by the earthy scent of soil turned by the plow. This is the true heart of the Middle Ages, not the castles or the cathedrals, but the endless toil of peasants who worked the land from dawn until darkness. A typical peasant's life followed the rhythm of the sun. At first light, you rose, your body stiff from straw bedding, hands already aching from the day before. There was no leisurely breakfast, no choice between coffee or tea. Instead, a chunk of coarse bread, maybe a sip of ale, and then straight to the fields. Your tools were simple and cruelly unforgiving. A wooden plow, iron-tipped if you were fortunate, dragged by oxen whose ribs showed through their hides. Seeds were scattered by hand, bent over row after row. Come harvest, you swung a sickle, each motion pulling against your back until the muscles screamed. Records suggest a medieval farm worker burned more than 4,000 calories a day without supplements, without rest days, without gyms. Survival was the workout, and the hours? During harvest season, 16-hour days were common. Under the high summer sun, your skin blistered and peeled. In winter, your hands cracked and bled from cold. Illness did not excuse you, because crops would not wait. To fall behind was to starve when winter came. The diet reflected this exhaustion: bread, pottage, ale, occasionally onions or cabbage. Meat was so rare that a holiday feast could mark the highlight of your year. Yet you worked not for yourself, but for your Lord. The feudal system bound peasants to noble estates. A portion of your harvest went as rent, another portion to the church as tithe, and only what remained filled your family's bowls. Imagine a family of 6 huddled in a one-room hut. The father and mother worked side by side, the children sent to chase birds from the fields or gather firewood. Even children as young as 5 were part of the labor force. There was no childhood as we know it, only a smaller set of hands to lighten the burden. And yet, within this grind, there was rhythm and resilience. Plowing, planting, reaping each season brought its own pattern. The church bells marked time, calling for prayers at dawn, noon, and dusk. The village, bound together by sweat, gathered for feasts after harvest. There was laughter then, music, even dancing on the hard-packed earth. Still, famine hovered like a shadow. One poor harvest could mean disaster. The Great Famine of 1313-7 killed millions as relentless rains rotted crops. Chronicles tell of people eating dogs, cats, even bark stripped from trees. Farmers watched helplessly as fields turned to mud, their families wasting away before their eyes. The body paid the price for this relentless labor. Bones bent, spines twisted, joints swelled with arthritis. Archaeologists studying skeletons of medieval peasants find evidence of heavy wear: damaged knees, crushed vertebrae, shoulders grooved by decades of carrying loads. A man of 35 was already old in the fields, and yet there was pride too. The peasant fed the kingdom. Castles and cathedrals stood only because peasants bent their backs to the soil. Every loaf of bread, every barrel of ale, every sheaf of wheat was pulled from the earth by hands calloused and raw. Picture yourself walking past a harvest scene in medieval England. The air hums with the sound of sickles cutting stalks. Sweat pours down faces burned red by the sun. Children dart between rows carrying bundles twice their size. A mother pauses only long enough to wipe her brow with her sleeve before returning to the field. The labor is endless, but so is the will to endure. For all their suffering, peasants anchored medieval life. They endured hunger, toil, and disease, yet they rose each day with the sun, knowing survival demanded no less. It was not glory, not chivalry, not legend. It was persistence. And without it, the Middle Ages could not have existed at all. Step away from the fields, and the rhythm of plows and sickles gives way to a different kind of labor. The pounding of hammers, the hiss of boiling vats, the choking smoke of workshops. If peasants broke their bodies in the soil, tradesmen scarred theirs in fire, fumes, and filth. The blacksmith's forge was the heart of every village. Step inside, and the air is so thick with smoke that your eyes water instantly. Sparks fly as iron glows orange, hammered into plowshares, horseshoes, or weapons. Each swing of the hammer carries risk. A shard of metal could pierce your skin, the heat could blister your arms, the fumes could choke your lungs. Blacksmiths often went blind young, their eyes clouded by years of staring into fire. Yet without them, no farm tool, no armor, no nail could exist. Across town, the tanner's yard reeked so fiercely it could be smelled half a mile away. Animal hides were scraped clean, then soaked in vats of urine and dung to loosen hair and soften the leather. Imagine standing knee-deep in that mixture for hours, your skin yellowing, the smell seeping so deep it clung even after death. Tanners were necessary. They made shoes, belts, armor straps, but they were shunned. Some towns forced tanneries outside the walls, as if hoping distance could hide the stench. Then there were the dyer's queue, boiling vats of woad, madder, and indigo to color cloth. The fumes turned the air blue and clung to workers' hands until their skin seemed permanently stained. Imagine emerging from a workshop with blue palms, your neighbors joking that even death would not wash it away. Candlemakers had their own curses. They boiled talawanimal fatun till it filled the streets with a greasy stench. The candles they produced were precious, but their shops stank of death and smoke. Soap boilers fared no better, their cauldrons bubbling with lye strong enough to strip skin. Children were often bound into these trades through apprenticeship. At 7 years old, a boy or girl might be sent to live with a master craftsman, working 6 days a week, often 14 hours a day. Apprentices cleaned, fetched water, tended fires, and endured beatings meant to teach discipline. Only after years, sometimes a decade or more, could they hope to become journeymen, earning wages of their own. Few reached the rank of master, and fewer still escaped the scars of their youth. The work could be deadly. In the mines of Central Europe, men dug for silver, tin, and coal. Without ventilation, the air turned foul. Without supports, tunnels collapsed. Miners emerged bent, coughing black dust, their lives often cut short before 40. Yet silver funded kingdoms, so the mines kept digging, swallowing generation after generation. Not every trade was violent or foul, but many carried their own quiet dangers. Bakers worked nights, inhaling flour dust until their lungs weakened. Millers risked fires when sparks caught in grain. Just a single flame could turn a mill into an inferno. Weavers strained their eyes over dim looms, going blind by middle age. And then came the dirty jobs of desperation. Pure finders collected dog feces to sell to tanners for use in curing hides. Link boys, often poor children, carried torches at night for wealthy passers-by, exposed to the dangers of thieves and drunkards in the alleys. These jobs paid pennies, but pennies kept you alive. Picture a town square at dusk. The forge roars, its glow painting the cobbles red. The tannery stinks beyond bearing, but workers labor on, hands deep in hides. The dyer's vats steam, clouds of strange color drifting into the evening sky. Children scurry between shops, fetching water, carrying scraps, eyes already dulled by exhaustion. These were not glamorous roles. They did not earn songs or statues, but they were the pulse of the medieval world, each trade filling a gap in the endless cycle of survival. Farmers may have fed the people, but craftsmen clothed them, shoed them, armed them, lit their homes, and built the very walls of their towns. Still, the cost was immense. To be a tradesman in the Middle Ages was to sacrifice health for necessity, to surrender comfort for skill. The forge burned your lungs, the tannery poisoned your skin, the dye house stained your body, the candle shop coated you in grease. You worked not to thrive, but to endure. This was medieval craftsmanship, a world where survival was bought with scars, where every shoe, sword, or cloak carried the hidden toll of the bodies that made it. If you were born into the Middle Ages, your childhood would not be a blur of toys and carefree afternoons. It would be short, hard, and heavy with duty. By the age of 7, you were no longer a child in the way we understand the word. You were labor. For peasant children, the fields became your classroom. At dawn, you might be chasing crows away from the newly sown grain, or fetching buckets of water from a well deeper than your own height. By 10, your hands were blistered from gripping hoes, your back sore from stooping beside your parents. Play existed, yes, but it was stitched between chores, a quick game with sticks or a race down the muddy lane before being called back to carry firewood. Childhood joy was fleeting, like a stolen loaf before the overseer's eyes turned your way. For those in towns, another path awaited: apprenticeship. At 7 or 8, your parents might send you to live with a master craftsman blacksmith, weaver, cooper, or mason. It was less a contract and more a surrender. For years you lived under another man's roof, eating at his table, sleeping in a corner of his shop. You worked 6, sometimes 7, days a week, rising at dawn, collapsing at dusk. Your tasks began small: sweeping the floor, pumping the bellows, running errands. But slowly, you learned the secrets of the trade: how to temper iron, how to weave a pattern, how to measure timber with nothing but cord and chalk. Apprenticeship was brutal but binding. Masters had the right to discipline with whips or fists. Apprentices could not marry, could not own property, could not leave until their years of service, sometimes 14, were complete. And yet, to endure was to open a door. At the end, you might become a journeyman, traveling town to town, offering your skills for pay. Few ever reached the rank of master, for that required money, guild approval, and connections. Still, to carry a craft was to carry dignity, however scarred your body had become. And what of girls? Many worked at their mother's side, spinning flax, weaving, brewing ale, tending animals, or serving in households. Wealthy families might send daughters to convents where nuns taught them to read, write, and copy manuscripts. But for most, education was measured not in letters but in the repetition of tasks: stirring pots, mending clothes, rocking cradles. Some girls apprenticed too specially in textiles or ale brewing, though guilds often barred them from full membership. Imagine being that child, your parents leading you to the gates of a master's house. You carry a small bundle, perhaps a change of linen, maybe a wooden spoon of your own. The door closes behind you, and suddenly the rhythm of your life belongs to another. Days blur with smoke, hunger, scolding, and the endless repetition of craft. Nights are spent dreaming not of play, but of freedom. And yet, years later, when you finally earn your first coin, the pride feels like sunlight breaking through the fog. Education as we know it was rare. A village might have a priest who taught a few boys their letters, enough to read scripture. But books were luxuries, handwritten on parchment, worth more than a farm. Knowledge spread slowly, like whispers carried by the wind. Most people lived and died illiterate, their learning etched not on pages, but into the muscles of their arms and the calluses of their hands. And yet, medieval children were not without laughter. Festivals and holy days brought brief reprieves: May Day games, dancing around poles with ribbons, Shrove Tuesday feasts before Lent, Christmas carols sung in drafty churches lit by flickering candles. In these moments, even apprentices could forget the lash of their masters, if only for a song's length. But childhood was fragile. Disease struck quickly. A fever could take a child in days. 30% of children never lived past the age of 5. Parents, hardened by grief, sometimes named children after the siblings who had died before them, as if names themselves could be recycled until one finally survived. Picture it now. A boy of 8, sleeves rolled up, face smudged with soot, hammering nails beside his master. His hands are small, but his eyes are older than his years. Or a girl of 10 bent over a spindle, her fingers deft though raw, humming softly to keep time with the whir of thread. These were the children of the Middle Ages, not shielded, not indulged, but thrust into the crucible of survival. This was childhood then, a brief apprenticeship to life itself, one that began in work and ended, if you were lucky, in the chance to pass your craft, your field, your strength, to the next. Part 9. Ni Tan Chung Shan Hoi, 1 St. Froinon 302. Not every job in the Middle Ages was noble or even tolerable. Beyond the farmers bent over fields and the blacksmiths hammering at their forges, there existed a shadow world of labor reserved for the desperate. These were the jobs you took when you had nothing left, when hunger gnawed louder than dignity. One of the most infamous was the link boy. By day, he might beg for scraps in the market. By night, he carried a torch through the twisting alleys, guiding wealthy merchants and nobles to their doors. It sounds harmless, even useful, but imagine the reality. A child of 8 or 10, flame in one hand, the other clutching a coin purse that thugs in the dark would gladly slit a throat for. Link boys were easy prey for robbers, and some were accused of luring patrons into ambushes themselves. Yet, when every other path was closed, this flickering torch was survival. Then there were the pure finders. Their task: collect dog feces, scoop it from the muddy streets, and sell it to tanners who used it in curing hides. Imagine crouching in gutters at dawn, hands black with filth, while townsfolk sneered as they passed. The pay was pennies, but pennies kept bread on the table. The stench, though, never left. Pure finders could be identified by smell alone, shunned as if the very air around them carried contagion. And worse still were the kooky gong farmers, tasked with scraping human waste from cesspits. By night, they climbed into pits thick with filth, filling buckets until their arms trembled. The pay was high, 4 times a laborer's wage, but at a price. Their lives were shortened, their social standing non-existent, their very presence unwelcome in taverns or churches. They lived on the margins, invisible and indispensable. Other jobs carried humiliation too. Women without dowries or protection often turned to sex work. In many towns, brothels were not only tolerated but regulated, with earnings taxed by the crown. Yet prostitutes lived on the knife's edge, exposed to disease, condemned by priests, yet needed by soldiers and merchants alike. Some cities forced them to wear special clothing, a yellow scarf, a striped cloak, so their shame would be public. Their work fed them, but branded them. Rag pickers, mudlarks, and beggars formed the last line of desperation. They sifted through refuse for scraps of cloth, bones to sell to glue makers, or bits of metal to trade. Mudlarks trawled riverbanks, sinking in sludge, searching for nails, rope, or broken tools. Beggars filled every church step, some genuinely crippled, others feigning injuries to stir pity. Towns passed laws against them, but the poor multiplied faster than the laws could control. Imagine standing at the edge of a bustling market square. Merchants shout prices for cloth and spices. Nobles stride past in velvet, their boots spotless. But beneath their gaze, in the gutter, a pure finder kneels, scraping muck into a basket. Nearby, a ragged boy waves a torch, hoping a patron will pay him for light. A woman leans against a doorway, scarf tied to mark her trade. Their existence is tolerated but never respected. They are the gears beneath the machine, turning silently, unwanted but essential. And yet, in these margins, there was resilience. Some link boys survived long enough to join guilds or serve households permanently. Some prostitutes found protection from wealthy patrons, climbing a rung above starvation. Rag pickers became small traders, piecing together a fragile livelihood. Even the pure finder's basket held opportunity. Filth turned into coin, coin turned into bread. Still, these jobs carried an invisible brand. To be a gong farmer, a pure finder, a prostitute, a beggar was to be marked as unclean, untouchable. Society needed your labor but despised your presence. You were both servant and scapegoat, the reminder of poverty's shadow that no one wished to see. Picture yourself forced into such work. Your family is starving, no fields to till, no trade to learn. You pick up the bucket or the torch or the ragged shawl. The coins you earn keep your siblings alive another day, but the shame clings like dirt that no water can wash away. This was the bottom tier of medieval labor. not heroic, not remembered, but endured. And in their endurance lies a truth. The Middle Ages were built not only by lords and knights, not only by farmers and craftsmen, but also by those who scraped, carried, and suffered at the very edge of survival. Walk into any medieval village or town, and you'll feel it, the ever-present weight of poverty. Hunger wasn't an occasional visitor, it was a permanent resident. The great lie of history books is that poverty was exceptional. In truth, it was the default. A day laborer in medieval England might earn a penny, maybe two. Enough for 2 loaves of bread if prices held steady. But bread alone does not fill a family of 6. When wheat harvests failed or wars disrupted trade, that same penny might buy half as much. In years of famine, it bought nothing at all. Imagine working from dawn to dusk, carrying stone, hauling timber, repairing roads, only to come home with a coin so thin it could barely stretch across a single meal. For peasants tied to the land, payment wasn't always coin. Many paid their dues in kind, a portion of wheat to their lord, a chicken to the bailiff, labor owed at harvest for no pay. After tithes to the church-owned tenth of everything you grew, you were left with scraps. Enough to keep you alive, perhaps, but not enough to thrive. Picture a mother tearing a loaf in half, counting every crumb as if it were gold dust. Children reach with eager hands, but she measures carefully, leaving a portion aside for tomorrow. Hunger taught patience, but also despair. Chroniclers described families scraping pots clean with bits of bark, drinking weak broth made from bones boiled to nothing. And while peasants starved, nobles feasted. A single banquet in a lord's hall might consume more meat and spice than an entire village would see in a month. The contrast was not hidden, it was flaunted. Food was not just nourishment, but a show of power. A roasted peacock on a silver platter declared wealth in a way that words never could. Meanwhile, the villagers who baked the bread and raised the geese might never taste such luxuries in their lives. Minimum wage, as we know it, did not exist. There is only the minimum you need so you don't die before finishing your work. The system ensured you lived just long enough to labor another day. If you fell sick, you were replaced. If you aged, you were discarded. Poverty was not accidental, it was engineered. Children carried this burden too. By 7, they were already working, not for pocket money, but to keep their families alive. A boy might guard sheep for a few pennies a week. A girl might spin thread late into the night for merchants who sold it at 100 times the price. Childhood was measured in work, not play. And yet, even in this grinding poverty, there was resilience. Villagers shared food when they could, neighbors pooling resources in times of famine. Communal ovens baked bread for entire communities, their smoke rising as a rare symbol of unity. Markets bustled with barter, where eggs might be traded for cloth scraps or firewood for a handful of onions. Poverty did not erase ingenuity, it forced it. But famine remained a constant threat. In the Great Famine of 1315-1397, rains drowned fields, cattle died of disease, and crops rotted in the ground. Starvation became so dire that people dug up roots, ate grass, and in whispered rumors turned to cannibalism. One chronicler wrote of gaunt figures wandering roads, their eyes hollow, collapsing in ditches as travelers passed. Even outside famine years, poverty was relentless. Winters bit hard, with fuel scarce and bellies empty. Summer brought long hours in fields, sweat soaking through tattered tunics. Shoes wore out quickly, and many walked barefoot, their feet hardened to stone. Clothes were patched and repatched until nothing remained but a quilt of rags. Picture yourself at the end of a 14-hour day in the fields. You return home to a hut with no chimney, smoke curling inside until your eyes sting. Your wife hands you a bowl of thin stew, more water than food. Your children chew hard crusts in silence. Outside, the manor windows glow with candlelight, the Lord's feast echoing with music. You listen, hungry not just for bread, but for a life you will never touch. This was the medieval truth of poverty, grinding, engineered, unavoidable. And yet, out of that poverty came endurance. They survived not because life was kind, but because their will was stronger than hunger. The peasants' suffering was the foundation upon which castles rose and kingdoms flourished, their pennies, their scraps, their laboral invisible, yet essential. Close your eyes and imagine waking in a medieval hut. The straw beneath you itches with lice, and your throat burns with fever. There are no pharmacies, no doctors as we know them, no pills waiting in a cabinet. In the Middle Ages, sickness was as common as hunger, and the cures often killed faster than the disease. Illness was explained not by germs, which no one yet understood, but by the balance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you had a fever, it meant your body had too much blood. The cure? Bleeding. A physician would slice open a vein and drain life into a bowl, convinced he was drawing out the sickness. Sometimes leeches were used instead, clinging to the skin until they swelled with stolen blood. One medical text even recommended applying 70 leeches at once. Imagine lying on a wooden bench, skin clammy, while blood dripped steadily into a copper basin. Your neighbors nod approvingly, certain this ritual will save you. In truth, it leaves you weaker, closer to death. Herbal remedies existed too, passed down from midwives and wise women. Garlic for infections, honey for wounds, chamomile for fevers. Some worked more by accident than design. Others were dangerous. Mercury was prescribed for skin conditions and syphilis, its poison searing organs from within. Opium soothed pain but left its own mark of addiction. Medieval medicine rarely asked, "Will this harm the patient?" The assumption was simple: if it hurts, it must be working. Diseases stalked villages like wolves. Smallpox scarred faces, leprosy devoured flesh, dysentery emptied bodies into weakness. A simple cold could spiral into pneumonia, a cut into sepsis. With no antibiotics, infection was a death sentence. Midwives who aided childbirth often lost both mother and child, their hands clean by appearance but deadly with unseen bacteria. And then there was the Great Terror, the Black Death. Between 1347 and 1351, the plague swept through Europe, killing half the population. Imagine carts rolling through streets piled with bodies, bells tolling endlessly, the air heavy with burning incense meant to ward off miasma. Families locked doors, abandoning neighbors, even children. Priests blessed mass graves, tossing lime over the bodies before covering them in earth. Children rarely survived childhood at all. Nearly 1 in 3 died before the age of 5, often from fevers, diarrhea, or infections, so ordinary today we wouldn't think twice. Parents grieved, but grief itself hardened into routine. Some named newborns after lost siblings, as if recycling names might trick fate into sparing one. Dentistry was its own nightmare. Toothaches were treated with cautery, literally pressing hot irons to gumsore with extraction by force. No anesthetic, just screams echoing across the village. Skulls excavated from medieval cemeteries show jaws riddled with abscesses, cavities rotting into bone. The pain must have been unbearable, a constant companion. And yet, amid this horror, there was resilience. Monks in monasteries copied ancient medical texts, preserving Greek and Arab knowledge. Some surgeons advanced surprisingly far trepanning skulls to relieve pressure, stitching wounds with linen thread, even using wine as an antiseptic without knowing why it worked. Islamic physicians, in particular, influenced medieval Europe with their emphasis on observation and hospitals. But for the majority, such sophistication was unreachable, locked behind language, money, or walls. Picture yourself falling ill in a small village. The priest comes, swinging incense, murmuring prayers to drive out evil air. A local healer crushes herbs, muttering charms as she binds a poultice to your skin. Your family gathers, waiting to see if God will spare you. You feel weaker with each hour, the remedies burning, cutting, or bleeding you dry. Perhaps you recover. More likely, you do not. In this world, health was fragile, disease inevitable, and medicine often a cruel gamble. Yet people endured. They prayed, experimented, trusted tradition, and hoped. Survival was never guaranteed, but still they lived on, raising children, tending fields, and facing each dawn with bodies forever at war with sickness. This was medieval medicine, part faith, part guesswork, part cruelty. A world where every cough could be a death knell, and every cure carried its own shadow of danger. If there is one shadow that hung over every medieval home, it was the shadow of death in the nursery. Childhood was fragile, and survival was never promised. To be born in the Middle Ages was to step into a world where 1 in 3 children would not live to see their 5th birthday. Imagine a mother bending over a cradle in a one-room hut. The baby's cheeks are flushed, the skin burning with fever. There is no medicine, no doctor to call. She wipes the sweat with a corner of her apron, whispering prayers through tears. By morning, the fever might break, or the cradle might fall silent forever. Diseases that we dismiss today were executioners then. Measles, whooping cough, dysentery, ordinary childhood illnesses swept through villages like storms. Diarrhea, the simplest of ailments, could dehydrate a child in days. Without clean water, remedies often worsened the sickness. Babies fed weak ale instead of milk grew listless, their tiny bodies too frail to endure. Malnutrition sharpened the knife. Poor families struggled to feed their children beyond thin pottage and crusts of bread. When harvests failed, infants wasted away in their mother's arms. The famine of 1311 left countless mothers burying infants before they had learned to walk. In skeletal remains from the period, archaeologists find signs of rickets, scurvy, and stunted growth children broken by hunger before they had a chance to live. Accidents claimed others. Fires from open hearths, drowning in village wells, injuries from tools left unattended. With homes crammed full of family and livestock alike, danger lurked in every corner. A toddler could fall into a fire as easily as into sleep. Parents did their best, but life itself was merciless, and yet grief did not lessen with frequency. Though child death was common, it was never ordinary. Medieval parents loved fiercely, even knowing the odds. Letters and wills preserve tender mentions of my sweet daughter taken too soon. In one chronicle, a father describes planting a tree at his son's grave, hoping it would grow where the boy could not. To cope, families sometimes reused names. A child who died might be replaced, in name at least, by a younger sibling John after John, Alice after Alice. It was as if by persistence the family hoped to outwit death. But the grief still lingered, etched into lullabies, whispered in prayers at night. Religion offered solace, but also fear. Priests taught that unbaptized infants could not enter heaven, their souls condemned to limbo. Imagine the panic of a mother rushing to a church with a feverish baby, begging for baptism before death claimed it. Some priests recorded baptizing infants minutes after birth, just in case the child never took another breath. And yet, children also brought joy when they survived. Festivals saw them dancing, chasing ribbons, singing hymns in candlelit processions. The laughter of children was a fragile kind of music, a reminder that life could resist death, however briefly. For every family that buried a child, another clung to the miracle of survival, of a small body growing taller, stronger, defying the odds. Picture a village churchyard, its ground uneven with tiny graves, each mound marked with a wooden cross, many already weathered away. Parents kneel, laying flowers, whispering prayers, before walking back to their huts to care for the living children still clinging to them. Death did not stop life, it walked beside it. This was the medieval reality. To love your child deeply, knowing tomorrow might take them. To celebrate each birthday as a triumph, a small rebellion against the statistics. To endure loss again and again, and still find the strength to bring new life into the world. Childhood in the Middle Ages was not guaranteed, it was a gamble. And every family lived with the knowledge that the smallest cough, the tiniest fever, could tip the scales toward tragedy. Step into the shadow of medieval justice, and you enter a world where law was less about fairness and more about fear. To live under this system was to know that punishment could strike at any moment, for any reason, and often without evidence at all. The law varied wildly from town to town. What was legal in one village could be a hanging offense in the next. There were no unified codes, no constitution, only local customs, decrees from lords, and the iron hand of the church. Imagine being accused of a crime you didn't know existed, cutting wood in the king's forest, or failing to pay a tithe. You stood before a court not to prove your innocence, but to beg for mercy. Justice relied heavily on trial by ordeal. To prove your honesty, you might be forced to carry a red-hot iron across 9 feet. If your burns healed cleanly within 3 days, God had declared you innocent. If they festered, which, without medicine, they almost always did, you were guilty. Another ordeal bound the accused and threw them into water. If you sank, you were innocent. If you floated, you were guilty and executed. It was a no-win game where the verdict was written on your body. Punishments were brutal and public. Steal a loaf of bread, and you might lose a hand. Speak against your Lord, and you might lose your tongue. Over 200 crimes in medieval England carried the death penalty, ranging from theft of livestock to treason. Hanging was considered merciful compared to being drawn and quartered, dragged through the streets, half-hanged, disemboweled, then cut into pieces for display. And these were not hidden acts. Executions were festivals. Crowds gathered, vendors sold food, children perched on shoulders to watch. It was entertainment as much as warning. The suffering of one was the spectacle of many. In a world with few amusements, the scaffold became theater. For nobles, the story was different. Wealth could buy escape. A noble accused of a crime might demand a trial by combat, hiring a skilled fighter to stand in his place. Others paid blood money, offering coins to a victim's family to avoid punishment. Meanwhile, the poor, with no money and no champions, stood defenseless. Justice wore a blindfold, but it peeked beneath to see if you carried gold. Prisons were not places of long sentences, but holding pens until punishment could be carried out. Imagine a dungeon, dark, damp, bodies chained to walls, rats scurried over straw. The state provided no food, you relied on family to feed you, or you starved. Torture was common, not just as punishment, but to extract confessions. The rack stretched limbs until joints cracked. Thumbscrews crushed fingers. The Iron Maiden, if it existed at all, was said to pierce flesh with spikes. Few withstood such torments. Most confessed anything, true or false, simply to make it end. Even humiliation was weaponized. Minor offenders were locked in the stocks, their heads and hands trapped while townsfolk hurled mud, rotten vegetables, and insults. Women accused of gossip might be strapped to a ducking stool, plunged into water again and again until they nearly drowned. Justice was not blind. It was cruel, creative, and relentless. Imagine standing in a square, watching a trial. The accused, a gaunt man, trembles as the priest declares the ordeal. Villagers murmur, some pitying, others eager for spectacle. The man lifts the hot iron, skin blistering instantly, the smell of burning flesh filling the air. He stumbles, drops it, and the verdict is written. 3 days later, the wound festers. Guilty. Sentence. Execution. You watch him hang from a rope, the crowd cheering, children laughing, as though this death were a holiday. And yet, amid this brutality, there was also a kind of order. Fear of punishment kept villages obedient. Trials, however twisted, gave the illusion of divine justice. People accepted the system because to doubt it was to doubt God himself. Better to believe that ordeals reflected heaven's judgment than to admit chaos ruled the earth. This was the law in the Middle Ages. Unpredictable, unequal, merciless. To be accused was to be condemned. To be poor was to be powerless, and to survive was to stay invisible. Justice did not protect the weak, it crushed them, feeding their pain to the crowd as both warning and entertainment. It was not fairness that defined medieval law, it was fear. And fear, in the end, was the strongest ruler of all. Step inside the prison walls of a medieval castle, and you enter a place where time itself feels like it has stopped. The air is damp, thick with mildew, heavy with the stench of human waste. Chains rattle in the dark, and the only light comes from a slit in the stone, just wide enough for a rat to slip through. These were not prisons of reform. They were waiting rooms for torment and death. Dungeons served one purpose, to hold the accused until justice, or something masquerading as it was carried out. Prisoners were shackled to walls or floors, left to sit in filth, with no food unless family members brought it. Many starved before their trials even began. For those who endured, the ordeal of imprisonment was only the beginning. Torture was not a shameful secret, but a sanctioned tool of law. Judges and inquisitors saw it as the surest way to extract truth. Confession was king, and truth mattered less than the act of submission. Once you confessed true or false, your fate was sealed. The rack was the most infamous. Prisoners were tied hand and foot, then stretched by cranks until joints dislocated, tendons tore, bones cracked. Screams echoed through stone halls, designed not only to break the body but to terrify all who heard. The thumbscrew was smaller but no less cruel, crushing fingers until nails split and bones powdered. The boot forced wedges into wooden frames around a prisoner's legs, splintering shin bones with each hammer blow. The scavenger's daughter. A twisted frame of iron compressed the body into a crouch so tight that blood burst from the nose and ears. Imagine a man strapped to the rack, his body pulled inch by inch, muscles tearing. Guards pause to ask a question. Did you steal from your lord? The prisoner shakes his head, choking on pain. The cranks turn again. Minutes stretch into eternity. At last, he screams a confession, true or not. The torture ends, but his life as he knew it is already gone. The Iron Maiden, often depicted as a coffin lined with spikes, may be more legend than reality, but other devices were all too real. Whipping posts, branding irons, boiling cauldrons, all left marks that spoke louder than words. Even water itself was a weapon. The strappado suspended prisoners by their wrists, dislocating shoulders, while buckets of freezing water were poured over them to shock body and soul. Torture wasn't limited to hardened criminals. Witches, heretics, debtors, all could find themselves in the dungeon. A woman accused of sorcery might be stripped, shaved, and pricked with needles to find the devil's mark. A man accused of debt might be beaten until his family paid. Children could be tortured too, their small cries echoing in chambers built for fear. And the purpose was not just punishment, it was performance. Trials became theater, confession spectacles, pain a kind of currency. To endure torture in silence was rare. Most confessed quickly, knowing there was no mercy in resistance. Confess or suffer, then suffer anyway, might as well have been the motto of medieval law. Picture yourself descending into one of these dungeons. The torchlight flickers on wet stone. You hear groans, chains scraping, and then screams. The sound of humanity reduced to raw agony, a reminder to all who lived above that power was absolute. You leave shaken, but those inside do not leave at all, except as corpses carried through the gates. Still, not all prisons were filled with torment. Some castles kept high-ranking prisoners in relative comfort, rooms with windows, beds, even servants. Nobles captured in war could live for years as guests, ransomed for gold. But for commoners, prisons were pits. There was no justice, no fairness, only the grinding weight of stone, the gnawing of hunger, and the certainty that pain waited just ahead. This was the reality of medieval prisons, not places of correction, but factories of fear. Every chain, every device, every scream reinforced the message. Power ruled, and the powerless suffered. To stand in a dungeon was to stand at the edge of despair itself, where hope was stretched, broken, and silenced by stone and iron. Step into the market square of a medieval town, and you may find the usual bustle of vendors and townsfolk interrupted by something far more captivating: punishment as public theater. Justice was not hidden behind closed doors. It was dragged out into the open, where humiliation became both entertainment and warning. One of the most common devices was the stocks. Imagine a wooden frame set in the center of the square, with holes for the head and hands. The offender, perhaps a thief who stole bread, or a drunkard who insulted his neighbor, was locked inside, forced to sit for hours or even days. Passers-by hurled rotten food, mud, or worse. Children jeered, dogs barked, and the prisoner, trapped and aching, could do nothing but endure. The goal was not rehabilitation, but shame. For women accused of gossiping or disobedience, the punishment might be the ducking stool. Strapped to a chair fixed to a long beam, the woman was plunged again and again into a pond or river, gasping for air as the crowd laughed or cursed. It was less about crime than control, reminding women of their place in a world that tolerated little resistance. Pillories stood in larger towns, upright frames where criminals were locked standing, their faces exposed to the scorn of the community. Sometimes signs were hung around their necks describing their crimes. A baker who cheated customers might be forced to wear a loaf around his neck, or a liar branded with a hot iron so his face carried his crime forever. These humiliations were often more feared than physical pain. To be scorned by your neighbors, to see children mocking you, to be remembered forever as the one who was locked in stocks, this cut deeper than the lash. In small communities, reputation was survival, and humiliation destroyed it. Picture a square on market day. A man sits in the stocks, mud dripping down his face. A woman sells turnips beside him, casually tossing one rotten into his lap. Children dance around, chanting songs about his crime. The crowd laughs, not cruelly by their measure, but as if attending a festival. For them, punishment was a spectacle, a lesson wrapped in amusement, but humiliation could escalate into pain. Some punishments included branding, burning letters into flesh T for thief, V for vagrant. Others involved hilaihi, whipping. In public, backs striped with blood while the crowd watched. The punishment was not just to the body, but to the soul, stripping dignity away. And for repeat offenders, humiliation might lead to exile. To be driven from your village was to lose your home, your neighbors, your place in the world. In an age where community was survival, exile was nearly as final as death. There is a striking parallel here with the present. Medieval stocks may be gone, but public shaming remains. Today it takes place on screens rather than squares, words hurled like rotten food across social media. The medium has changed, but the impulse is the same: to expose, to humiliate, to punish before a crowd. Yet, within this cruelty, communities found reassurance. Public humiliation reminded them that order existed, that crime had consequence, that the village was not ruled by chaos. It was theater with a purpose: keep the peace through fear and shame. Imagine yourself as the one in the stocks. Hours stretch into eternity. Your neck aches, your wrists burn. The sun beats down, flies land on your skin. You hear laughter, insults, jeers. A child throws a rotten apple, and it smashes against your cheek. You cannot wipe it away. You cannot escape the eyes of your neighbors. When at last the constable releases you, the chains may be gone, but the mark of shame remains. This was public humiliation in the Middle Ages, punishment not hidden in shadows, but shouted in the square, where everyone was judge, jury, and executioner of dignity. A crime could wound your body, but punishment wounded your place in the world forever. As dusk settled over medieval towns, a different kind of figure emerged: the night watchman. These were not armored knights or trained soldiers, but often the elderly, the infirm, or men considered too weak for heavy labor. Their job was simple in theory: patrol the streets, call the hours, and raise the alarm if trouble came. In practice, it was a lonely, dangerous, and often futile task. Picture an old man, cloak wrapped tight against the chill, leaning on a staff as he limps down a cobbled lane. His lantern flickers, throwing shadows that twist across crooked walls. He calls out the hour 10 o'clock, and all's well, though he knows well enough it isn't. Behind shuttered windows, families sleep uneasily, praying thieves or fires will not strike their homes. Night watchmen carried little more than a horn or rattle to sound the alarm. They had no weapons save sticks or perhaps a rusty sword, and no authority beyond their voice. If they caught a thief in the act, what could an old man do? He shouted, hoping townsfolk would rouse and give chase. Justice by mob was more effective than justice by watch. Criminals knew this weakness. Gangs of cut-purses prowled the alleys, blades hidden beneath cloaks, waiting for drunkards to stumble home from taverns. Fires, the greatest terror of any medieval town, could start from a single candle or spark in the night. Watchmen were expected to spot the smoke early and sound the alarm, but many fires raged out of control before help arrived. Entire neighborhoods could burn before sunrise, leaving ashes where homes once stood. To walk the night was to court fear. Wolves prowled outside the walls, and inside, desperate men could be just as dangerous. Some watchmen were beaten or even killed when they stumbled upon crimes. Others fell asleep at their posts, exhausted or drunk, punished harshly if discovered. The job was thankless, mocked by townsfolk who muttered that watchmen were little better than beggars with lanterns. And yet, without them, towns would have been defenseless. Their calls marked the passing of the hours. Their horns rallied neighbors when danger came. Even if they could not stop a thief, their presence reminded the community that someone watched, however weakly, against the dark. The elderly found in this role a bitter kind of purpose. Too old for the fields, too frail for war, they could still serve. Better to be mocked as a watchman than to starve as a burden on one's family. For some, the night became their livelihood. Their lantern, a fragile shield against irrelevance. Imagine standing in a medieval street at midnight. The air's heavy with smoke and damp. You hear the shuffle of feet, the crack of a staff on stone, and then a wavering call. Midnight, and all's well. Somewhere in the dark, thieves crouch in shadows, listening. Somewhere else, a fire smolders unseen. The watchman's voice trembles, but still he walks, still he calls, still he stands between the town and chaos. This was law enforcement in the Middle Ages, frail patchwork, more hope than strength. The night watchman embodied the fragility of order itself, an old man's voice echoing in the dark, declaring peace where none truly existed. If the medieval world was already harsh with hunger, disease, and law, war made it infinitely worse. Conflict was not a rare calamity, it was a rhythm of life. For the average person, war was something you could expect to see more than once in your lifetime, whether in the form of raiding bands, sieges, or vast campaigns like the 100 Years' War. That war between England and France stretched from 1337 to 14531, or 16 years of on and off fighting. Imagine being born as the war began and dying before it ended, never knowing a time of peace. For soldiers, war meant mud, blood, and exhaustion. For peasants, it meant burned fields, stolen livestock, and famine. No one escaped untouched. On the battlefield, reality bore little resemblance to the songs of knights in glory. Mud sucked at boots, arrows darkened the sky, and screams drowned out prayers. At the Battle of Towton in 1461, nearly 28,000 men were slaughtered in a single day, roughly 1% of England's entire male population. Snow fell as the bodies piled, and many froze to death before swords ever touched them. Weapons defined survival. Knights in full plate armor, gleaming like iron statues, were rare, their equipment costing the equivalent of a modern sports car. Most soldiers wore padded garments called gambesons, stitched with scraps of metal if they were lucky. Common weapons were spears, axes, and tools repurposed from farms. Swords were luxury items. The true terror was the longbow, 6 feet of yew that could pierce armor at close range. English archers trained from childhood, their skeletons twisted by the strain of drawing 200-pound bows thousands of times. Their deformed bones remain silent testimonies to a life spent in preparation for war. Imagine standing in the ranks as an archer. Your fingers are calloused into claws, your spine curved from years of training. You raise your bow, pull until your muscles scream, and release into the storm of arrows. Thousands fly at once, blotting out the sun. A moment later, you hear the sickening thud of steel-piercing flesh, the cries of horses collapsing, the earth itself shaking under the weight of chaos. For peasants caught between armies, war was worse than battle. Armies lived off the land, which meant stripping villages bare. Soldiers took grain, slaughtered animals, and burned homes. Civilians fled into forests, clutching children and praying to be spared. Those left behind might be raped, beaten, or murdered. The phrase, "support our troops," had no meaning. Armies supported themselves by devouring the countryside. Even if you avoided direct violence, war stole your future. Fields trampled, barns burned, mills destroyed. How do you plant next year's crop when this year's has been ground into mud? Hunger followed armies like a second plague, and then there were sieges. Picture a castle surrounded by enemy tents, banners fluttering, horns sounding at dawn. Inside, villagers huddle, food dwindling, water fouling. Weeks turn to months. Rats vanish from the alleys, eaten by the desperate. Cats follow. At the siege of Paris in 885–886, people consumed anything that moved. Other sieges lasted years, grinding defenders into starvation until surrender seemed merciful compared to famine. Disease, as always, was the greatest killer. Thousands of men crowded together, with little sanitation, became breeding grounds for dysentery, typhus, and plague. Chronicles of the Crusades note armies losing half their numbers to illness before ever reaching battle. The sword might kill you in an instant, but sickness stalked every day and night. Picture yourself as a farmer watching the horizon. Smoke rises in the distance. You know what it means. Soldiers are coming. Do you flee into the woods, leaving everything behind, or stay and hope they pass you by. There is no good choice. If you run, you may starve on the road. If you stay, you may die by the sword. Either way, war reaches you. This was the truth of medieval conflict, not glory, not honor, but endless loss. War was not the clash of knights in shining armor. It was the burning of fields, the freezing of men in snow, the cries of women in ruined villages. It was a drumbeat that never ceased, echoing across generations, binding every life to the shadow of violence. Step onto a medieval battlefield, and the first thing you notice isn't the clash of swords. It's the arsenal of tools that turned men into killers. War in this age was a brutal craft, and every weapon told a story of ingenuity, desperation, and blood. For the wealthy, the ultimate symbol of status was plate armor. A full suit gleamed like polished steel, a walking fortress costing as much as a modern luxury car. Only nobles or elite knights could afford it, and wearing it declared not only wealth but superiority. Beneath the armor, however, was a man as fragile as any peasant, sweating and gasping under the crushing weight. Most soldiers could never dream of such protection. Instead, they fought in gambesons quilted jackets stuffed with rags, animal hair, or straw. Sometimes small plates of metal were sewn in, but these jack-of-plates were heavy and clumsy. Against arrows or sword blows, they offered limited salvation. For many, survival meant nothing more than a sturdy shield and sheer luck. Weapons were equally stratified. Knights carried sword symbols of nobility, passed down like heirlooms. Their blades were crafted with care, balanced for both cutting and thrusting. But swords were expensive. The average foot soldier wielded light spears, axes, or farm tools repurposed for war. Imagine a scythe meant to cut wheat swinging instead at armored men. The line between farmer and soldier blurred quickly when the levy was called. The terror of the age, however, was the English longbow. 6 feet of yew wood, drawn with immense strength, capable of piercing armor at close range. Archers trained from boyhood, practicing until their bones themselves warped from the strain. Excavated skeletons of medieval archers show enlarged left arms, twisted spines, and shoulders permanently misshapen. They carried their deformities as marks of service, bodies reshaped into weapons long before the battle began. Imagine standing in formation, bow in hand, as thousands of arrows rise in unison. The air hisses with their flight. For a moment the sky darkens as if night itself has descended. Then comes the sound. Arrows thudding into flesh, shields splintering, horses screaming as iron-tipped shafts punch through hides. Entire lines crumble before swords even cross. But the bow was not the only horror. Crossbows, though slower to reload, packed incredible power. The church once declared them unfit for Christians to use because they killed too efficiently, piercing armor that swords could not. Yet armies adopted them eagerly, their bolts cutting down knights once thought invincible. Then came the dawn of gunpowder. By the late Middle Ages, cannons thundered across battlefields, their blasts shaking earth and men alike. Castles that once stood unbreachable now cracked under bombardments. The age of walls was ending, replaced by the roar of artillery. For the ordinary soldier, life in arms was grim. You were levied from your village, given a weapon, and marched to war. Training was minimal. Death was nearly certain. Pay, if it came at all, barely fed your family. You fought not for glory, but because refusal meant punishment, or worse, the branding of coward. Knights lived by the code of chivalry, but reality rarely matched the romance. Many knights were brutal, driven more by plunder than honor. Chronicles tell of pillaging, rapes, and massacres committed by men who wore crosses on their tunics while wielding swords in slaughter. Chivalry was as much propaganda as practice. Picture a medieval camp the night before battle. Fires flicker, men gnaw on hard bread, sharpening blades in silence. Archers flex their arms, wincing from years of strain. A knight kneels in prayer, his armor beside him, gleaming in the firelight. Across the field, enemy torches glitter like stars fall into earth. The air hums with fear, anticipation, and the knowledge that tomorrow many will never rise again. This was the life of medieval soldiers, divided by wealth, united by blood. From knights in shining armor to peasants clutching farm tools, each man carried into battle not only a weapon, but the certainty that war cared little for status. Armor might buy you minutes, skill might buy you moments, but death was always near. Weapons shaped the Middle Ages, but they also reshaped the men who bore them, warping bodies, hardening souls, and leaving scars both visible and hidden. Every sword, every bow, every cannon blast whispered the same truth. War spared no one, not even its victors. If war was a storm that swept across medieval Europe, siege was the slow, grinding famine that followed. Few things were more terrifying than seeing enemy banners on the horizon, armies settling like wolves around your walls. Once the gates were shut, you were trapped. What began as vigilance quickly curdled into hunger. Inside besieged towns, food dwindled with alarming speed. Grain was rationed, meat vanished, gardens stripped bare. At first, rats were hunted, cats and dogs cooked in secret. Soon, leather belts were boiled into broth, parchment scraped and chewed like bread. Chronicles of the Siege of Paris, 88 tell of people so desperate they ate whatever they could tear from the earth or the street. In later sieges, rumors whispered of cannibalism, neighbors vanishing in the night, bones found gnawed clean. Imagine yourself inside such a town. The market square is empty, stalls abandoned, the smell of smoke drifting from enemy camps outside the walls. Mothers clutch thin children, lips cracked from thirst, while men argue in hushed voices about surrender. Every toll of the church bell feels heavier, not calling to prayer, but to despair. The enemy outside is patient. They burn fields, poison wells, and wait. Soldiers jeer from beyond arrow range, knowing that hunger is their greatest ally. Occasionally they fling dead animals or plague-ridden corpses over the walls with catapults, turning food into rot and water into poison. The defenders fire arrows, pour boiling oil, hurl stones, but their strength fades with each day. The longest siege in recorded history, at Candia, Heraklion, on Crete, dragged on for 21 years in the 17th century. Though later than the Middle Ages, it shows the same relentless pattern. A city suffocating under hunger, disease, and the constant threat of attack. In shorter medieval sieges months rather than decades, the suffering was just as acute. Survival was not measured in victory, but in how long you could endure. For civilians, choices were grim. To flee meant risking capture, rape, or murder. To stay meant starvation. Sometimes, defenders expelled the poor to conserve food for soldiers. Thousands of women and children were shoved out of gates into no man's land, where besieging armies refused them passage and defenders barred re-entry. These outcasts starved between the lines, human sacrifices to prolong the garrison's strength. Picture a mother among them, clutching an infant too weak to cry. She bangs on the gates, begging for mercy, but the guards above shake their heads. The army outside jeers, driving her back with spears. She sinks to her knees in the mud, trapped in a limbo of death where compassion has no home. Sieges were not just military, they were psychological. The sight of enemy banners, the thunder of siege engines, the endless drumming of war outside the walls all eroded hope. The creak of trebuchets flinging stones, the boom of rams against gates, became the heartbeat of despair. Nights were punctuated by the cries of sentries and the sudden collapse of towers. Sleep offered no relief, and if the walls finally fell, worse awaited. Victors poured through gates, looting, burning, slaughtering indiscriminately. Women raped, men butchered, children dragged away. Survivors might envy the dead. Medieval warfare had no Geneva Conventions, no treaties of mercy, only the brutal logic of conquest. Yet, amid this misery, there were sparks of resilience. Chronicles tell of townsfolk who sang hymns on ramparts, even as their bellies hollowed, of mothers who tricked hunger by feeding children first, of defenders who endured months of siege, only to emerge triumphant when relief finally came. Hope clung stubbornly, even in famine's grip. This was the medieval siege, not the clash of knights in shining armor, but the silent terror of empty bowls, the sound of hollow stomachs, the slow erosion of strength. To survive was to chew leather, to drink foul water, to watch neighbors waste away. To endure was to hope for dawn beyond walls that felt more like coffins. Hunger, more than swords or arrows, was the deadliest weapon of all. Step beyond the battlefield and into the towns and cities of the Middle Ages, and you'll find another battlefield, this one of smells, class, and survival. Life within the walls was both crowded and cruel, a place where privilege and poverty rubbed shoulders on narrow streets. The first thing that struck any newcomer was hygiene, or rather, the lack of it. Bathing was rare. Many believed water opened the pores and let disease slip in, so most washed only a few times a year. In summer perhaps, and again before winter. Otherwise, they wore the same sweat-stained tunics and hose until fabric rotted at the seams. Parasites thrived. Lice combs were as common as knives, and fleas leapt from straw bedding to skin each night. To smell another person was to know them, a constant reminder that life itself stank. Clothing, too, marked your place. Peasants wore rough linen and heavy wool, garments patched until they became little more than rags. Wealthy merchants draped themselves in bright dyed cloth scarlets and deep blues, and nobles in silks that glimmered in candlelight. Laws called sumptuary laws often dictated who could wear what, as if fabric itself must reinforce the order of society. Shoes for peasants were thin leather, flat and flimsy, leaving feet calloused from mud and stone. Nobles strutted in pointed shoes so long and curled they had to be tied to their knees. The ridiculous shapes declared wealth. No man who worked could wear them. Fashion became a weapon of class, each hem and stitch a declaration of who belonged above and who remained below. Inside homes, privacy was non-existent. Families slept in one room, often sharing beds not only with children, but with travelers or neighbors when space demanded. Even wealthy houses swarmed with servants, present in every chamber, to eat, to sleep, even to give birth always observed. Secrets were rare luxuries. Language itself divided worlds. The English of the 1400s would sound foreign to modern ears. A villager might greet you with, "What is thy nama?" and you'd struggle to recognize the meaning. Across Europe, dialects shifted from valley to valley. A traveler might walk 30 miles and find himself unable to understand the market calls. Information moved as slowly as feet could carry it, twisted along the way by rumor and fear. Superstition filled the void left by ignorance. A solar eclipse sent towns into panic, convinced the world was ending. Comets were omens of plague or war. Witches were blamed for crop failures, demons for madness. With so little education, the line between natural misfortune and supernatural punishment blurred. Priests thundered from pulpits, their sermons binding fear into obedience. Entertainment reflected the roughness of life. Public executions drew the largest crowds, part punishment, part carnival. Bear-baiting pits roared with the clash of dogs against chained beasts. Fairs brought jugglers, minstrels, and storytellers, but such joys were fleeting. For most, leisure was a rare break from toil, a gulp of ale at a tavern, a tale told by firelight, laughter echoing in a room thick with smoke. The feudal system locked people into rigid roles. 90% of the population were peasants, tied to the land they did not own. Above them stood the nobility, lords who claimed the fruits of peasant labor, and above them, kings who ruled by divine right. Social mobility was a dream for mostrare, whispered about, but almost never achieved. Even merchants who grew rich through trade often faced resentment from nobles who despised wealth unmoored from bloodlines. Picture yourself walking through a city gate. On one side of the street, beggars cluster, holding out bowls, eyes hollow. On the other, a merchant's house gleams with stained glass windows, his daughters draped in velvet. Children dart through alleys barefoot, while knights ride past in gleaming armor. The contrast is unbearable, yet ordinary and everyday reminder that fate, not effort, defined your place. And yet, even here, resilience shone. Neighbors shared food during hard times, women sang at wells while drawing water, and families clung fiercely to one another. Festivals brought brief unity, candles glowing in churches, villagers kneeling side by side, regardless of wealth. Humanity persisted, even amid filth and division. This was medieval urban life, noisy, filthy, and divided by class, yet alive with stubborn survival. A world where lice itched beneath every collar, where superstition ruled minds, where walls could not hide poverty from wealth. Life in the city was not a romantic vision of knights and ballads. It was the unvarnished grind of humanity, pressed together, enduring one breath at a time. And so, after walking the narrow streets, after breathing the smoke and filth, after watching battlefields drown in mud and blood, we finally step away from the Middle Ages. You've seen their hunger, their sickness, their punishments, their endless toil. You've heard the cries in dungeons, the bells of siege, the laughter of children who may not live to see another spring. And through it all, you felt the one constant of that world: endurance. The people of the Middle Ages were not armored knights from fairy tales, nor faceless peasants lost to time. They were men and women who carried on despite impossible odds, who bent their backs against plows, who stitched clothes by candlelight, who prayed in whispers while plague carts rattled by. Life was never gentle to them, but still they lived. Still they loved. Still they hoped for tomorrow. Close your eyes and let the world of stone walls and smoky hearths fade. Imagine instead the hush of twilight settling over a quiet village. The fields lie fallow, the fires burn low, and in the dark, even the watchman's call drifts into silence. You smell lavender carried faintly on the breeze, damp hay, and wet paper curling in the cool night air. Let the noise of war and punishment soften into echoes. Let the weight of history become no heavier than a dream. You can release it now, knowing those lives, however brutal, were lived with resilience that outlasted centuries. Sleep then, not in a dungeon or battlefield, but here in the gentle dark, where stories rest and where time itself loosens its grip.